Let's pose the question, is Canada safe and secure? Could Canada defend itself if it had to? Most Canadian citizens don't know the answer to these questions. In fact, most Canadians simply don't think about Canada's national defense at all. Ironically, it seems only US President Trump has been successful in making Canada's national security a topic up here in Canada. The commander of the Royal Canadian Navy recently said he was quite confident our Navy could stop Russia or China if they were to attempt to send ships through the strategically vital Northwest Passage without first asking for permission. We wouldn't need the Allies to come to our aid. We could deal with it ourselves, he said. He further added that the ships he would use were not intended to be frontline combatants, but that there is the capacity to install other weapons in a sort of ad hoc manner. Forgive me, but this description of being ready and capable does not inspire confidence. And we shouldn't ignore the Admiral's earlier comments regarding the very serious challenges to the Navy that could lead to operational failure.
We're short people. We're short about 20% people, and so we really need to focus on attracting, recruiting, and training the best Canada has to offer.
Check out his YouTube video to hear what he had to say about an impending crisis in the Canadian Navy. This scene of the brand new HMCS Harry DeWolf does not inspire confidence, nor does this view of the Canadian Coast Guard patrol ship Corporal McLaren. The National Post reported that the Corporal McLaren will have the unfortunate honor of having spent the majority of its 10 years of service as a boat-shaped hulk of metal more accustomed to dry land than swelling seas. They could say the same thing about our submarine fleet of 4 boats. Deduction? We should not expect the Canadian Navy or the Canadian Armed Forces to be ready and capable for sustained Arctic operations. So just what does it mean to be ready and capable? Let's take a moment and consider not just the Arctic, but the defense of Canada. Canada has traditionally viewed its defense as a natural state of being. To the east, west, and north, the Atlantic, Pacific, and Arctic Oceans are formidable obstacles. To the south, a benevolent superpower nation with whom we enjoy much shared history, culture, language, business, and diplomacy. All of this has been reinforced by strong alliances with like-minded free nations. In summary, 3 oceans, a friendly superpower neighbor, and strong alliances has been Canada's defense plan for the past 70 years. But much has changed over the past 70 years. International business interests, as well as crime networks, have proven capable of making borders almost invisible to them. Cyber, digital, criminal, and financial conflict rages on the internet. Canada has secret Chinese police stations inside major Canadian cities. Russia has invaded its Ukraine neighbor state and is conducting hybrid warfare against its Baltic state neighbors. Check your map, Canadians. Russia is also our neighbor. Allies also change over time. Do you think Germany and Japan are best friends with Canada these days? Then there's the melting Arctic ice and the possibility of major shipping through those waters. Canadian ownership of the Northwest Passage is contested. Not all nations agree it belongs to Canada. Most consider it an international waterway according to international convention. And finally, our superpower southern neighbor is moving towards protectionism, and with alarm, it has become very clear that the incoming Trump administration no longer considers Canada a good or trustworthy ally.
But we don't need anything. We don't need their fuel. We don't need their energy. We don't need their oil and gas. We don't need anything that they have.
What do you think of Canada's national security and defense plans? Oceans, Americans, allies. Does it still work? Let's test this idea against a more enhanced threat scenario. Threat scenarios, like the one used by our Navy's commander, are excellent methods to decide what capabilities you need for defense. This threat scenario has 2 important conditions. Firstly, It is very important to remind you that nothing in this scenario is generated from the Inuit people or the government of Nunavut. This is simply an exercise to assess Canada's ability or not to defend itself in the Arctic. Equally important, this scenario in no way will try to depict Nunavut or its wonderful people as adversaries to the government of Canada, although they have a legitimate claim to be exactly that. The second important factor to consider is that all references to the following are true: the Clarity Act, the Canadian Constitution, the internationally contested Northwest Passage, open source assessments of Canada's defenses, Germany and Japan's frustration or anger with Canada, China and Russia's interests in the Canadian Arctic, Russia's actions against its neighboring states, the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service assessments on the Canadian Arctic, references to the capabilities of Canadian Navy ships and submarines, and finally, the incoming U.S. administration's comments regarding Canada as unreliable. These are all true. So on to building a threat scenario. We start with the knowledge that both China and Russia continue to try and develop relationships with Nunavut for resource exploration and production. In 2017 and 20, Chinese icebreakers sailed through the Northwest Passage. The expedition's goals included testing the feasibility of using the Northwest Passage as a trade route for cargo ships. We also know that the Canadian Security and Intelligence Service is trying to grow its presence in the North and deepen its relationship with Inuit communities in response to, and I quote, economic, strategic, and military interests of foreign states in the North. CIS has also stated that foreign interference is a significant threat primarily from China and then Russia. Both desire access to natural resources in the Arctic. When the federal government in Ottawa blocked the sale of the Doris North gold mine in Hope Bay to a state-owned Chinese company, it also blocked a 20-year land tenure and socio-economic agreement with the Inuit while producing nothing in return. When we consider the sustained efforts of the Alberta government to protect provincial jurisdictions, in particular their constitutional right to resource development, it is easy to imagine other provincial and territorial jurisdictions doing the same. When faced with a southern federal government that has never lived up to promises for the North, what is a territory like Nunavut to do? Quebec's separation from Canada is an agonizingly enduring and yet potential reality familiar to all Canadians. This particular threat to the state, this internal threat, resulted in the creation of the Clarity Act. When we cast our gaze north, it is easy to see how the Inuits' culture and history bestows grievances against Canada that far exceed those of, say, Quebec. For our enhanced threat scenario, then, we consider that based on generational frustrations with Ottawa and recent cancellations of Nunavut-based international resource deals, Nunavut decides to separate from Canada. It will use the incomplete functionality of the Clarity Act to present a clear question to the people of Nunavut, and then leverage a North American security crisis to generate the international recognition required to be a new state. Gaining international recognition is a big deal, and a very big deal when the parent state doesn't want the sub-state to leave. In our scenario, the Inuit recognize the world as it is. They are well aware of the capability of the Canadian government and the Canadian Armed Forces. Their vote was completed 18 days before President Trump was to be returned to the White House. They knew the Canadian forces were not at all capable of sustained operations in the North, and so, as a new state in the international community, Nunavut announced a deal with Russia and China to secure the air and water approaches to their new country as part of a series of resource exploration deals. It will be difficult to imagine the reaction and thoughts of world leaders to the idea of Russia and China having military forces stationed inside North America. But it is not difficult at all to understand that it would be entirely unacceptable to the United States. While this was happening, Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, South Africa, and some other states recognized Nunavut as an independent state at the United Nations. In this threat scenario, the Canadian government's options would be virtually zero. The Canadian Armed Forces were simply not capable of sustained operations in Canada's Arctic. Canada would have to look to its allies. And the Allied response would be what exactly? It wouldn't be an attack, so no NATO Article 5. Diplomatically, it would be an internal matter, except for the decision to recognize Nunavut. Canada would want to retain command and control of any operation since it would be inside Canadian territory. So what would Canada's request to its allies look like? Yeah, we haven't spent 2% GDP on national defense as pledged. We haven't invested in our military. Since Russia invaded Ukraine, we said no to Germany, Japan, and others for natural gas. We said no to a mission in Haiti. We skipped major NATO exercises. We slow roll NORAD funding. However, we would like you to place your military assets under our command so we can keep the Russians and Chinese out of our territory. And this would be presented to not just any president, this would go to President Trump. Even on a very good day when Canada was considered a reliable ally, this sort of request would never be considered. This wasn't going to be a bad joke about a 51st state. Besides, Nunavut had no intention to become a sub-state of yet another uninterested southern government. In the end, the partial international recognition of Nunavut at the United Nations and the impending arrival of Russian and Chinese military units forced the US to act immediately. Somewhere else on the planet, Trump might not care to let a territory change hands. But inside North America was another matter entirely. There was no way this would be allowed. So the US acted quickly. It made its own deal with Nunavut. A better deal, a great deal, the best deal ever, to replace the one made with China and Russia. They would defend the air and sea approaches in exchange for resource exploration and development rights. And in return, they would also recognize Nunavut as an independent state at the United Nations. This recognition would be quickly followed by Germany and Japan. And just like that, Nunavut was no longer part of Canada. It was an independent state with considerable international recognition at the United Nations, and it was partnered with a superpower for its defense. The Inuit were acting as best as they could for the benefit of their people, for their national interests, and for their national security. Canada lost just one seat in its parliament, but it also lost 21% of its geography, 243,000 kilometers of coastline, most of its contested Northwest Passage, 37,000 citizens, and so much more. The protection from three oceans, the Americans and good allies, that had characterized Canada's approach to defense was now exposed for the fraud it was. If Nunavut could make its own way, what about the other provinces and territories? Successive Canadian federal governments have ignored Canada's national interests and national defense. The defense minister himself recently said that he couldn't get any interest in defense from around the cabinet table. And internationally, Canada has become an untrustworthy and unreliable ally. Canada has 3 territories and 10 provinces for now. There are other states in the world who would happily take the whole thing or grab pieces for themselves. This idea is now routinely front-page news thanks to our southern neighbor. Whatever you may think about President Trump, should we really expect the United States to act in our interests or their own interests? Foreign powers have already determined, and in some cases declared, that access to the Arctic and the Northwest Passage is in their national interest. Canada is simply not ready or able to push back. The Royal Canadian Navy's threat scenario was quite straightforward: Russian and Chinese ships trying to make an unauthorized transit through the Northwest Passage. It is not such a stretch to visualize a resource development fight between a province or territory and Ottawa growing into an international incident. And then what? These threat models are powerful tools. This simple, believable threat scenario exposes Canada's national security for the fraud it is. Canada is not secure. Did you notice? Do you see the broken ice?